Hi there everyone. Today I'm reviewing The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. So incidences of mental health disorders are continuing to increase, but the mental health of many countries deteriorated all the way back in the 2010s. And Haidt argues in this book that the structure of childhood, the advent of social media and smartphones, the reduced in-person contact and, for children, playtime has had a hugely negative impact on mental health. With people from an early age spending ever increasing amounts of time online and not in real contact in person with people, Haidt makes the case that these factors have led to a deterioration in mental health. The book is divided up into several clear parts. The decline of the play-based childhood is explored in the first one, the rise of the phone-based childhood analysed in part 2, and then Haidt's recommendations for returning to a healthier childhood raised in the third section. The angles within these, the kind of sub-chapters, such as looking at why social media harms girls more than boys, or what schools and parents can do, also make sense from a kind of structural standpoint. Of course, there is a plethora of angles that an author could take in writing this book. And Haidt, having researched in depth clearly from the kind of list of sources, clearly knows the literature and has used it well. Perhaps the last section is the weakest in my mind about what parents and schools could do. It's a set of suggestions, really, to improve things based on, the problems that Haidt raises through the rest of the book. But this is arguably harder to write convincingly, because obviously a lot of it is kind of supposition and just ideas. And although for the most part the ideas were reasonable and well thought out, I did find it far less compelling than the earlier sections. What's important for the general reader, though, is how clear and well the book is presented. Chapters have a clear summary of the main points at the end, many of which are supported throughout the chapter by easy to understand graphs. It's refreshing to see such a well thought out and carefully structured book for a popular science book, as they can often fall prey to tangents and kind of getting bogged down in certain aspects. Or even arguments that kind of seem to be built in response to what evidence the author has available rather than what's actually out there, and sort of rather than challenging the questions that actually need to be answered. So Haidt kind of takes a good structure, he lays things out clearly, and I think he doesn't kind of dodge any of the hard questions. The book investigates interesting threads. How usage of phones has adversely influenced sleep, for example, is symptomatic of my wider interpretation of this book as a whole. Many of the ideas might be ones you're familiar with. We kind of all know that it's obviously not good to kind of have like bright lights shining in your eyes right before sleep. Melatonin kind of interacts with sunlight, for example. So if you're seeing loads of bright light, your body kind of assumes that actually it's earlier in the day. But, not all of these ideas are groundbreaking in the book. But what it does provide is the kind of evidence, the kind of reasoned arguments, and it's very clear at laying this across. So even if you've read a bit around the topics, you'll still be glad that you've read it as concisely and convincingly presented as it is here. I'm going to just share a quote from the book. I open quote. After considering the 4 reasons that girls are particularly vulnerable, we can see why social media is a trap that ensnares more girls than boys. The lure is the promise of connecting with friends, enticing for girls who have strong needs for communion. But the reality is that girls are plunged into a strange new world in which our ancient evolved programming for real-world communities misfires continuously. Girls in virtual networks are subjected to hundreds of times more social comparison than girls had experienced for all human evolution. They are exposed to more cruelty and bullying because social media platforms incentivize and facilitate relational aggression. Their openness and willingness to share emotions with other girls exposes them to depression and other disorders, end quote, and that's from page 170. So the general thrust of the book is that phone-based and social media-based childhoods lead to a host of negative outcomes. and to list quite a few of them, but not all of them. Less familial time, less time engaging with what is in front of you, proxies for community that aren't as good as real in-person contact, less time with friends, less time spent playing with other children, and less resilient children. The latter example is particularly important, one of resilience, but one which has become, unfortunately, arguably kind of politicised. It now seems to be taken as a conservative view that children need to toughen up, or a progressive view that they should be respected and given greater acknowledgement and care around their mental health. And I personally think neither are necessarily wrong. But writers such as Haidt or Abigail Schreier in her book Bad Therapy point out that if children don't believe they can deal with problems, they're likely to experience mental health disorders. Here, Haidt mentions Nicholas Nassim Taleb's concept of anti-fragile, where some adverse events help create a resilient person. And I've reviewed that book, so have a look at that. And I'll probably put the link up above somewhere. Unfortunately, the societal trends Haidt outlines here are clearly having a detrimental impact. I think we all know it instinctively too, like the kind of sleep and smartphone example I mentioned earlier. Of course, it's not scientifically rigorous to say that we kind of just know it, it's not good for us. But it does mean that once more attention comes to these problems, maybe individuals will begin to take action themselves, and to increasing extents. Books that clearly lay a case out that these things haven't been good for society are much needed. And this one here tries to draw attention to a trend we know isn't good, in that instinctual sense I mentioned, and present the evidence that it kind of needs to be addressed by governments and society. So in terms of final score for The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, it's too simplistic and reductionist to argue that there is only one single cause for the deterioration of mental health, but community has always been crucial for well-being, and Haidt makes a compelling case that in childhood, changes have been wrought that have had a devastating impact. The book is clear in its writing and evidence, well supported, backing up the arguments it makes, and it's easy to read or listen to the audiobook. And hopefully actions will be taken by governments and society in response to books like this before it's too late. So I'm giving this one an 8 out of 10. It's very well structured and clearly lays out what the kind of challenge is, what the problem is, and what the kind of outcomes are. I didn't quite like the third section so much, where it's a bit more kind of, here's some ideas about how to fix things, which, you know, probably could merit a whole book of its own. But that's not to say it was particularly weak or anything. I think a lot of the ideas are actually quite good. So I'll be reviewing plenty more books, you know, some on mental health, some on psychology, but other genres too. So like and subscribe for that, and thanks for watching.